From Alexander's battlefield companion to rulers of history's most expansive successor kingdom, the Seleucids forged an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to India. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, Seleucus VIII survived exile to establish a dynasty that brilliantly fused Greek and Persian traditions. At its height under Antiochus III the Great, Seleucid armies conquered Syria and challenged Egypt, while their cities became multicultural hubs of commerce and learning. Yet their vast territory proved ungovernable, gradually crumbling as Parthia seized the east. Jewish revolts erupted in Judea, and Rome's shadow lengthened. By 64 BC, Pompey annexed their last territories, ending Alexander's most ambitious legacy. Stone dust rose beneath Macedonian boots as the great host crossed from Europe into Asia, their spears catching the sun in glittering ranks that stretched farther than any eye could follow. At their head rode Alexander, son of Philip, barely into his 20s, but already bearing the aura of destiny. Behind him flowed the hopes of a restless kingdom, hardened veterans of Cheronea, and ambitious youths chasing glory in lands whispered of since childhood. Ahead lay the remnants of Persia's vast dominion, a centuries-old empire whose roads, satrapies, and palaces were about to fall into foreign hands. The clash at Gaugamela in 331 BC shattered illusions of Persian invincibility. Dust swirled as scythed chariots charged and broke upon disciplined Macedonian pikes, while Darius III fled the field, leaving behind treasures and an empire's honor. In the aftermath, Babylon opened its bronze gates, not with defiance, but with ceremony. Priests of Marduk welcomed the conqueror with ritual gifts, acknowledging in him not just a destroyer, but the heir to Eastern kingship. From that moment, Alexander understood that victory was more than slaughter on battlefields. It was acceptance by those who guarded ancient traditions. Babylon and Susa became his gateways. The first, with its rivers and storied ziggurats, represented continuity with the Mesopotamian past. The second, with its jeweled halls and treasuries overflowing with bullion, symbolized the wealth that could fund a transcontinental monarchy. Persepolis, however, stood for something else entirely. When Macedonian torches consumed its palaces in a night of fire, stone lions cracked and painted reliefs blistered in the heat, a symbol of vengeance against Persia for generations of wars. Yet even in destruction, Alexander carried off artisans and scribes, fusing Greek ambition with Persian resources. He did not sweep away Persian governance. Instead, he set his garrisons atop the old satrapal system, preserving the royal roads and treasury channels that had long bound distant provinces to the heart. Persian officials continued to manage accounts, but alongside them now stood Macedonian overseers and Greek scribes. The bones of empire remained Persian. The sinews and breath were Macedonian. This pragmatic layering would become the skeleton upon which Seleucus I and his descendants later built their fragile dominion. Beyond the Iranian plateau, resistance stiffened. In Bactria and Sogdiana, where snow-fed rivers cut through mountain ranges, the conqueror faced more than open battle. These frontier peoples fought with ambushes and sudden strikes, their horsemen vanishing into deserts where phalanxes could not march. Villages melted into fortresses of stone and cliff. Years of grueling campaigns followed. Alexander himself wounded more than once in desperate encounters along the Oxus. He responded with a mixture of brutal reprisals and gestures of inclusion, founding cities like Alexandria Eshate, planting colonies of veterans and artisans to anchor Greek presence where Persian arms had always struggled. Marriage became another tool of conquest. At Susa in 324 BC, the conqueror staged a spectacle that stunned even his closest companions. In one vast ceremony, 10,000 Macedonian soldiers wed Asian women, their dowries paid from royal treasuries. At the center of this union stood Alexander himself, taking Statera, daughter of Darius, while his officers received noble brides from Persia and beyond. Among them, Seleucus I took Apamea, a Sogdian noblewoman whose lineage rooted her in Bactria's proud traditions. These unions were more than sentiment. They represented an attempt to graft Macedonian steel to Persian legitimacy, creating families whose children would inherit claims in both worlds. Roxana, the Bactrian bride he had earlier chosen for himself, embodied this vision most vividly. Daughter of a noble chieftain, her beauty captured campfire whispers, but her bloodline mattered more. Through her veins flowed local authority that no Greek general could ever command. Their marriage tied Alexander not only to Eastern aristocracy, but also to a political experiment. Could a Macedonian king become an Iranian monarch without ceasing to be himself? The answer would remain unsettled long after his death. Not all his followers accepted this blending. At Opis, near the Tigris, he announced that Macedonian veterans who wished to return home would be discharged with honors, while Persians would henceforth serve alongside Greeks in his army. Rage erupted. Thousands of battle-scarred men shouted betrayal, furious that foreigners might stand in the ranks of Philip's phalanx. Steel clashed as tempers flared, and the mutiny threatened to unravel years of conquest. Alexander responded with ruthless theater, executing ringleaders and reminding his troops that their glory had been won by his vision, not their pride. Yet beneath the reconciliation feast that followed lay cracks that would widen after his death, cracks the Seleucid kings would inherit like poisoned gifts. While politics stirred the camp, stone and brick marked more permanent ambitions. Across Asia, new cities rose with Greek grids, but Persian courtyards, places where merchants from both traditions mingled. Alexandria Eschate, the furthest Alexandria, anchored Macedonian authority on the edge of Sogdiana, while other foundations dotted trade routes, linking Mediterranean harbors to Central Asian markets. These cities became seeds, planted in hostile soils but watered by armies and caravans, destined to grow into the civic heart of Seleucid power. By 323 BC, Babylon once again became the hub of the known world. Into its palaces returned the conqueror, his body weakened by wounds and fever, but his mind still ablaze with schemes. Further conquests in Arabia, fleets to circle Arabia's coast, even dreams of reaching Carthage and Rome. Soldiers, merchants, scribes, and priests all crowded the city, their voices a babel that mirrored the empire's contradictions. On June nights, when torchlight flickered across the hanging gardens, whispers passed that no man could rule such vastness without divine favor. Then came the fever. In the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, as the Euphrates glimmered beyond the walls, Alexander's strength ebbed. Companions filed past his bed, asking to whom he left his empire. His voice, faint but unyielding, gave the reply that would haunt generations: to the strongest. On June 10th, 323 BC, he breathed his last, leaving no heir but a pregnant Roxana and an infant yet unborn. Around his bier, generals who had marched with him from Macedon now glared at one another, each calculating how to seize fragments of the shattered whole. What he left behind was not just a kingdom without a king, but a vision without an anchor. Satrapies stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. Cities gleamed newly founded. Treasuries brimmed with Persian bullion, and armies stood restless on foreign soil. Yet beneath this wealth and glory lay contradictions unresolved. Greeks who scorned Persians, Persians who resented Greeks, veterans longing for home, nobles suspicious of each other. It was into this chasm of opportunity and danger that Seleucus I, once a companion and bodyguard, would step. His path, uncertain and fraught, would carry forward the legacy of Alexander's Eastern dream and twist it into the empire that bore his name. The deathbed silence of Babylon had barely faded when the hall outside Alexander's chamber erupted with argument. His generals, men who had bled together across deserts and mountains, now quarreled over the corpse of empire. Roxana was pregnant, her unborn child the only legitimate heir. Yet few believed a baby could command the allegiance of hardened satraps. Some pressed the claims of Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, slow of mind but bearing royal blood. Others demanded immediate division, swords drawn as words failed. The empire that had stretched from Macedon to India began to fracture before its founder's body had cooled. In this storm stepped Perdiccas, commander of the companion cavalry, and appointed chiliarch, or chief minister, by Alexander himself. He claimed guardianship of both Aridaeus and the unborn child, holding authority not through crown, but through proximity to the dead king's will. Around him gathered allies who preferred unity under regency to a free-for-all scramble. Yet unity proved an illusion. Already Ptolemy, the calculating general who seized Egypt, built his own power base on the Nile. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed veteran, watched from Asia Minor with growing ambition. Lysimachus planted himself in Thrace, and in Babylon itself, Seleucus I, then commander of the elite Hypaspists, found himself swept into games larger than any one man. The partition of Babylon in 323 BC attempted to impose order. Satrapies were divided like spoils. Ptolemy received Egypt, rich in grain and gold. Antigonus was confirmed in Phrygia, Lysimachus in Thrace, and Seleucus I, still junior among giants, held Babylon as satrap. Yet even in this division lay seeds of endless war. Each man took territory not as steward, but as king-in-waiting. Armies swore loyalty to generals rather than crowns. The empire's vast wealth promised opportunity, but its very size guaranteed rivalry. Perdiccas soon revealed both brilliance and arrogance. Determined to preserve Alexander's empire as a single whole, he moved swiftly against any threat. When Ptolemy stole Alexander's body and carried it to Memphis, claiming the prestige of burial in Egypt, Perdiccas swore vengeance. His invasion in 321 BC became a march of hubris. Nile floods swallowed his supply lines. Crocodile-infested waters drowned his men. As he attempted to force a crossing, chaos erupted, boats overturned, and soldiers died by the thousands. His officers, weary of failure, turned their swords upon him in the night. The regent of Alexander's legacy perished at the hands of his own companions, his dream of unity sinking with him into the Nile's dark waters. The assassination reshuffled every alliance. At Triparadisos in Syria, a new carve-up of satrapies took place. Antipater, the veteran Macedonian regent in Europe, gained overarching authority, while Seleucus I was confirmed in Babylon. Yet no settlement could tame the ambitions unleashed by Alexander's death. Eumenes of Cardia, once secretary to the king, clung stubbornly to loyalty toward the royal house. His skill in battle matched his devotion, and for years he frustrated Antigonus, who pursued him across Anatolia and beyond. But loyalty alone rarely triumphs. At Gabiene in 316 BC, betrayal decided the day. Eumenes' own troops, lured by promises of their captured baggage, handed him over. Antigonus had him executed, silencing the last great voice of dynastic fidelity. With Eumenes gone, nothing remained to shield Alexander's heirs from obliteration. Antigonus now stood supreme across much of Asia, his banners unfurling from the Aegean to the Zagros, his ambition aimed higher still. He dreamed of ruling all Alexander had conquered. For Seleucus in Babylon, this dominance meant peril. The one-eyed general viewed him with suspicion, and soon pressure mounted until Babylon itself became untenable. In 316 BC, Seleucus fled his satrapy, abandoning the city that was supposed to be his charge. 7 long years of exile followed, years spent seeking allies, gathering scraps of power, and waiting for fortune's turn. During this wandering, Seleucus learned the art of survival. He found shelter with Ptolemy in Egypt, a rival of Antigonus who saw value in harboring Babylon's dispossessed satrap. The Egyptian ruler weighed allies like coins, and Seleucus became a piece in his broader strategy against Antigonid dominance. Together, they plotted strikes that could redress the balance of power. For Seleucus, the alliance offered more than protection. It offered the chance of return. The decisive moment came in 312 BC at the Battle of Gaza. Ptolemy and Seleucus faced Demetrius, the youthful son of Antigonus, whose confidence in cavalry and elephants seemed unshakable. But skill and preparation turned the tide. Seleucus, commanding Ptolemaic horsemen, struck with precision, shattering enemy lines. Demetrius fled, leaving behind not only the battlefield, but the illusion of Antigonid invincibility. For Seleucus, Gaza was more than victory. It was rebirth. In the smoke and blood of that field, he regained legitimacy, and with it, the chance to reclaim Babylon. His march back east carried the weight of destiny. Through desert roads and fertile valleys, he retraced paths once trod under Alexander's banners. Veterans rallied to him, merchants welcomed the return of stability, and priests measured omens in the stars. Each step closed the gap between exile and restoration. Yet the path was not without peril. Antigonid garrisons still held fortresses, satraps weighed loyalties, and the land itself seemed to test his resolve. Still, Seleucus advanced, not merely as a fugitive, but as a man returning to claim the heart of an empire. Babylon loomed at last, its walls familiar, yet fraught with danger. Inside lay divided loyalties. Some favored Antigonus, others yearned for a ruler who respected tradition. Seleucus entered not as conqueror alone, but as restorer. He promised temple privileges, honored the gods of the land, and sought the blessing of Babylonian priests who preserved ancient records on clay. In their diaries, scribes etched his name alongside kings of old, presenting him as heir not only of Alexander, but of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus. Where others sought thrones through force alone, Seleucus pursued legitimacy through culture and faith. Yet even as Babylon welcomed him, the war was not ended. Antigonus would not surrender Mesopotamia without struggle, and the years ahead promised blood along river crossings and in shadowed streets. Still, the return of Seleucus in 312 BC marked a hinge of history. Later ages would call this his Year One, the beginning of the Seleucid era, a dating system so enduring it would outlast the empire itself by more than a millennium. For a man once driven from his satrapy in disgrace, it was vindication. For the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, it was the dawn of a new dynasty. Thus closed a decade of chaos, when Alexander's dreams splintered into the ambitions of his heirs and rivals. Ptolemy entrenched himself in Egypt, Lysimachus in Thrace, Antigonus still powerful in Asia Minor, and Cassander rising in Macedon. But in the heart of Mesopotamia, Seleucus now stood poised to build something lasting. He had known exile, betrayal, and despair. He had gambled everything on a single battle and won. Now he returned to Babylon, not as a satrap, but as the founder of an empire that would carry his name across centuries. The stage was set for the Babylonian War, and with it, the first true test of the house of Seleucus. Dust curled along the banks of the Euphrates as Seleucus I marched eastward, his columns leaner than those commanded by rival kings, but hardened by years of struggle. Behind him lay the victory at Gaza, where Demetrius, son of Antigonus, had been humbled. Before him loomed the ancient walls of Babylon, seat of gods and kings. For 7 years he had been in exile, a guest in Ptolemy's halls, a soldier fighting under another man's banner. Now he returned not as satrap, but as claimant, ready to write his name in clay tablets beside monarchs who had ruled Mesopotamia for 1,000 years. Babylon did not fall with a single assault. The city's loyalties had splintered, its garrisons divided between Antigonus's supporters and those weary of the one-eyed general's harsh exactions. Seleucus entered as a restorer rather than a conqueror. He promised temple privileges to priests whose power reached back to Sumer. The Asagila, sacred to Marduk, once more received offerings. Scribal families, keepers of astronomical diaries and civic records, etched his name into their chronicles. Where Antigonus had demanded obedience, Seleucus offered continuity, draping his authority in the garments of legitimacy. In return, Babylon opened its gates and whispered his rule into the stars. But the war was only beginning. Antigonus would not abandon Mesopotamia, and his lieutenants moved swiftly to reclaim the province. What followed became a contest not of open battlefields, but of endurance, sieges, river crossings, and midnight assaults where loyalty shifted like sand in the Tigris. Seleucus relied on speed and surprise, striking at garrisons before reinforcements could arrive, then retreating into countryside where his cavalry outpaced pursuit. Antigonid commanders, overstretched from Anatolia to the Zagros, struggled to maintain supply lines across vast territories. Each fortress lost bled their authority. Each priest who blessed Seleucus diminished their cause. The Euphrates itself became a theater of war. Barges laden with grain drifted downriver, coveted prizes for both sides. Control of food meant control of men. And more than once, battles were fought not for palaces, but for the harvest that filled soldiers' bowls. Seleucus moved with cunning, capturing shipments and redistributing them with public ceremony, binding city dwellers to his cause through the simplest of currencies, bread. In taverns and temples, rumors spread that this Macedonian carried the favor of Marduk, for he provided where others plundered. Night marches marked his campaigns. Columns moved silently under moonlight, crossing rivers at fords known only to locals, appearing at dawn before walls unprepared for siege. Some garrisons opened their gates willingly, others fell to escalade, their defenders spared if they bent the knee. Seleucus understood that victory in Mesopotamia depended as much on reputation as on blood. Each temple restored, each archive respected, each priest consulted, turned Babylonian hearts toward him. In this policy lay a model for his dynasty, Greek in arms, Persian in ceremony, Babylonian in legitimacy. The priests, meticulous in their records, noted his deeds with a formality that outlasted battles. On cuneiform tablets, they inscribed his name alongside omens observed in the skies. Eclipses and planetary alignments, long regarded as signs of divine favor or disfavor, became entwined with his fortunes. In these diaries, Seleucus appeared not merely as a warlord, but as rightful successor to kings stretching back through Cyrus to Hammurabi. To rule Babylon was not simply to hold walls, but to command the heavens themselves. Seleucus grasped this truth instinctively and wove his authority through rituals older than Macedon itself. Still, the Antigonid shadow lingered. Antigonus dispatched forces eastward, determined to crush the upstart. Campaigns flared across Mesopotamia, their rhythm marked by ambush and reprisal. Seleucus's cavalry, many drawn from Iranian nobility, proved decisive. These horsemen knew the plains better than any Greek officer and taught their new master the tactics of steppe and desert. With their aid, Seleucus struck swiftly, cutting communications, isolating garrisons, and forcing Antigonid detachments to wither in hostile countryside. By turning local strengths into imperial assets, he transformed fragile alliances into durable power. By 311 BC, Seleucus stood master of Babylonia. The following year, when peace was declared among the warring successors, his control was recognized, if grudgingly. Yet recognition meant little without permanence. Antigonus still coveted the east, and the threat of renewed invasion hung heavy. Seleucus moved to entrench himself, not only with soldiers, but with symbols. He minted coins bearing his image alongside Babylonian motifs, a fusion of Hellenic portraiture and Mesopotamian reverence. In temples, sacrifices honored both Greek gods and local deities. In his court, Persian nobles stood beside Macedonian officers, each addressed with titles that signaled equality. A new kind of monarchy was taking shape, one that could stretch across cultures without tearing itself apart. 312 BC became more than a year of victory. It became the foundation of identity. Seleucus declared it year one of his reign, marking a new era that would outlast dynasties and invaders. The Seleucid dating system spread across the east, etched on documents, carved into monuments, referenced by merchants from the Mediterranean to the Indus. Long after his empire fell, communities still counted their years, from that moment when a fugitive returned to Babylon and claimed kingship. In time, this era would be used as late as the 16th century AD in distant corners of the Near East, a testimony to the durability of the idea he created. Yet the man himself did not rest. Consolidation required more than legitimacy. It demanded vision. From Babylon, Seleucus looked both east and west. To the east lay Satrapies bordering India, rich in elephants and cavalry, tempting prizes but vulnerable to local revolt. To the west lay Syria and Anatolia, corridors to the Aegean and the Mediterranean world, where rival successors contested every pass. For now, Babylon remained his anchor, but his gaze roved, already dreaming of a transcontinental monarchy that could rival Alexander's. His family, too, became part of this design. Apamea, his Sogdian wife, taken at Susa's mass wedding, stood beside him not merely as consort, but as symbol. Through her bloodlines, Seleucus bound Eastern nobility to his throne. Their son, Antiochus, represented a union of Macedonian ambition and Iranian legitimacy, a fusion that would define the dynasty. Where others cast aside their Eastern brides after Alexander's death, Seleucus kept his, proving that his vision of rule was not temporary expedient, but enduring principle. Still, dangers pressed. The memory of Antigonus loomed, and Demetrius, though beaten at Gaza, remained formidable. In Macedon and Greece, Cassander schemed. In Thrace, Lysimachus sharpened his ambitions. The successor world was a cauldron of rivalry, and Seleucus knew his grip on Babylon was but the first step. The time would come when alliances must be struck, wars fought, and elephants brought westward to decide battles on Anatolian plains. For now, though, he stood triumphant. From the embers of exile, he had forged a throne. From the chaos of Alexander's death, he had carved a dynasty. The Babylonian War had been less a single conflict than a crucible of legitimacy, where Seleucus proved his worth not only with spear, but with policy, not only with conquest, but with continuity. By blending Macedonian courage, Persian structures, and Babylonian reverence, he created the blueprint for an empire that would carry his name long after his bones returned to the earth. As the year 305 BC approached, he was no longer a satrap or fugitive. He would soon take the royal title of king, styling himself not merely as Alexander's companion, but as the heir of East and West alike. The house of Seleucus was built on Babylon's bricks, its foundations set in clay tablets and temple rituals, its future cast in the ambitions of a man who had turned defeat into destiny. Smoke still lingered in the skies above Mesopotamia when Seleucus I claimed a title that transformed him from survivor to sovereign. In 305 BC, he joined the chorus of Alexander's successors, who now styled themselves as kings. Antigonus in Asia Minor, Ptolemy in Egypt, Lysimachus in Thrace, and Cassander in Macedon all declared themselves monarchs rather than guardians of a dead conqueror's dream. For Seleucus, the declaration marked the culmination of years spent clawing his way back from exile. No longer a satrap clinging to Babylon, he now stood as Basileus in his own right, with ambitions that spanned continents. The act was not mere vanity. Kingship required symbols, structures, and legitimacy that transcended battlefield victories. Seleucus moved swiftly to craft the trappings of royal authority, shaping his realm into something recognizable as dynasty rather than personal fortune. Central to this vision stood his new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris. The founding of Seleucia was a statement written in stone. Situated on the river's banks, only a few miles from ancient Babylon, it drew upon Mesopotamia's traditions while redirecting power toward Macedonian designs. Where Babylon carried the weight of antiquity, Seleucia projected efficiency and clarity. Its streets ran in straight grids, lined with markets and administrative halls, a city designed to control both commerce and governance. At its height, it would swell to 600,000 inhabitants, a population rivaling Alexandria in Egypt. Greek settlers mingled with Aramaic-speaking locals, their voices blending in bazaars where spices from India and silver from Anatolia exchanged hands. Administration followed this diversity. Greek served in proclamations and civic charters, but Aramaic scribes kept tax rolls, ensuring continuity with Persian precedent. Rather than erase traditions, Seleucus folded them into his machinery of rule. The result was a capital that acted as a bridge, a Macedonian in origin, Mesopotamian in function, and international in character. Royal imagery reinforced this new monarchy. Seleucus struck coins that bore his profile in bold Hellenic style, modelled after Alexander, yet distinct in detail. On the reverse, symbols blended cultures, Zeus enthroned, but accompanied by Babylonian motifs. These coins circulated from Syria to the Persian Gulf, each piece a tiny ambassador proclaiming his authority. Soldiers received their pay in them, merchants weighed their worth against silver, and peasants glimpsed the face of a distant ruler in their daily exchanges. In an age where most subjects would never meet their king, coinage became the most powerful medium of sovereignty. Yet monarchy rested not only on administration and imagery, but on family. Seleucus's marriage to Apamea, the Sogdian bride given to him at Susa, proved unusually enduring. Where many of Alexander's companions had dismissed their eastern wives after his death, Seleucus kept his. Through Apamea, he tied himself to Iranian nobility, weaving legitimacy across cultural divides. Their son, Antiochus, grew up as heir to a vision that fused Macedonian conquest with Persian tradition. By elevating his Iranian consort, Seleucus demonstrated that his throne was not merely imposed from the west, but rooted in eastern soil. At court, he gathered companions known as the Friends of the King. This circle of philoi included Macedonian veterans, Greek adventurers, and Persian nobles, their loyalty bound by titles, estates, and access to royal favor. These friendships institutionalized loyalty, transforming what had once been Alexander's personal camaraderie into a durable framework of governance. The king's companions no longer simply drank together or fought side by side. They advised, administered, and commanded armies, forming the backbone of Seleucid administration. But while Seleucus secured the heart of his empire, storms gathered at its edges. The lands east of the Iranian plateau pressed against his authority with stubborn independence. In India, the Mauryan ruler Chandragupta had risen from exile to forge a powerful kingdom stretching across the subcontinent. The Satrapies, once held by Alexander's generals, Arachosia, Gedrosia, Paropamisadae, and Arya, lay vulnerable, caught between Seleucid claims and Mauryan ambition. Rather than march blindly into endless war, Seleucus chose diplomacy tempered with realism. Around 303 BC, he met Chandragupta in negotiations that would reshape the frontier. The Seleucid ruler ceded those four satrapies in exchange for something more valuable than territory: 500 war elephants. To Greek eyes, this might appear concession, but Seleucus recognized strategy in sacrifice. The satrapies were distant, difficult to supply, and more loyal to local elites than to any distant monarch. By trading them, he gained not only peace with a formidable neighbor, but also the very beasts that would decide the greatest battle of his life. These elephants, marched westward across mountains and plains, became the thunderous core of his army. Each animal towered above lines of infantry, armored and adorned, carrying towers from which archers loosed arrows. In a world where cavalry often decided battles, elephants shattered charges and sowed panic. When Seleucus led them into the climactic clash at Ipsus, their impact would echo across history. The treaty with India carried other fruits as well. Reports suggest that Chandragupta gave one of his daughters to the Seleucid court, a dynastic bond that symbolized peace. Caravans flowed with renewed vigor across the frontier, bearing ivory, spices, and silk into Seleucid markets. By yielding terrain, Seleucus secured prosperity and stability, converting borderlands into bridges of exchange. Meanwhile, his attention shifted westward, where Antigonus Monophthalmus cast a long shadow. The one-eyed giant had consolidated Asia Minor and Syria, threatening to dominate the Hellenistic world. Seleucus, remembering the years of exile imposed by Antigonus, recognized the danger. He joined a coalition with Lysimachus in Thrace, Cassander in Macedon, and Ptolemy in Egypt. Together, they prepared to confront the last great titan of Alexander's generation. But before that confrontation, Seleucus fortified his dynasty's western foundations. He established new cities across Syria, among them Antioch, which would grow into one of the ancient world's greatest metropolises. Situated on the Orontes River, it provided access to Mediterranean trade while commanding the fertile plains of northern Syria. Colonists filled its streets, theatres, and temples rose, and civic charters mirrored Greek ideals while accommodating local traditions. Alongside Antioch, foundations at Apamea, Laodicea, and Seleucia Pieria created a network of settlements that anchored Seleucid authority in the west. These cities were more than habitations. They were instruments of control. By settling Macedonian and Greek veterans, Seleucus secured loyal garrisons in key locations. Civic institutions fostered identity, linking settlers to the dynasty while binding local elites through partnership. Markets thrived, roads connected hinterlands to ports, and the king's authority pulsed through a web of stone and law. As the decade drew to a close, Seleucus stood astride an empire both fragile and formidable. In Mesopotamia, his new capital radiated order. In India, his treaty secured peace and elephants. In Syria, his foundations laid claim to the future. Yet looming on the horizon was the great reckoning. Antigonus, whose ambitions dwarfed those of all rivals, prepared to crush the coalition that threatened him. On the plains of Phrygia at Ipsus, destiny waited, and with it the moment when the elephants from India would prove their worth. For now, Seleucus could look upon his achievements with pride. From exile, he had risen to kingship. From Babylon, he had built Seleucia. From negotiation, he had gained elephants. And from vision, he had crafted a dynasty. The house of Seleucus stood no longer as an accident of fortune, but as a deliberate creation, forged in city walls, stamped on coins, and embodied in elephants that cast their shadows across 2 continents. Morning mist curled over the plains of Phrygia in 301 BC, as armies gathered for a battle that would decide the fate of Alexander's fractured inheritance. On one side stood Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed veteran who had once chased Seleucus I into exile. At his side fought his son Demetrius, flamboyant and daring, commander of cavalry renowned across the Hellenistic world. Facing them marched a coalition of kings who had little in common but fear. Seleucus, Lysimachus of Thrace, Cassander of Macedon, and Ptolemy of Egypt. United, they sought to crush the man whose ambition threatened them all. Seleucus brought with him a weapon no other commander could match: 500 Indian elephants, acquired years earlier in his treaty with Chandragupta. These beasts, armored and restless, stood as living fortresses between the armies. Antigonus possessed only 75. In the silent moments before the clash, both sides knew the weight of those numbers. The battlefield would not only pit men against men, but towers of flesh against lines of cavalry. When the fighting began, Demetrius unleashed his cavalry in a sweeping charge. Hooves thundered across the plain, scattering opposition with the shock of momentum. For a moment, it seemed as though Antigonus might seize victory through the speed and daring of his son. Yet Seleucus, holding the elephants in reserve, chose his moment with precision. He sent the massive beasts lumbering forward, interposing them between Demetrius and the battlefield he sought to dominate. The horses panicked at the scent and sight, refusing to press against walls of tusks and trunks. Cut off from returning to the main line, Demetrius' cavalry circled uselessly, unable to decide the battle. The coalition pressed the advantage. Infantry surged forward, pikes bristling as Antigonus's men fought with desperate valor. For hours the one-eyed king held his ground, bellowing commands, rallying soldiers with the charisma that had carried him through decades of war. But exhaustion mounted and gaps opened. Seleucus's elephants hammered into the flanks, while allied contingents drove wedges through the faltering line. At last, the aged titan fell, pierced by javelins, collapsing into the dust with his empire shattered around him. Antigonus's death ended the dream of reunifying Alexander's dominion under a single crown. In its place, the victors carved territories, like butchers dividing spoils. For Seleucus, the rewards were vast. He gained control over much of Syria, securing the land corridor that linked Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. His domain now stretched from the Indus frontier to the coasts of Asia Minor, a transcontinental empire that seemed to rival Alexander's own. The victory carried complications. Ptolemy, who had not fought at Ipsus yet, claimed Coele-Syria as his prize, refused to yield. Seleucus insisted the land was his by right of battle, while Ptolemy pointed to prior agreements. This unresolved dispute planted the seeds of the Syrian wars, 6 conflicts across a century that would define relations between their dynasties. Even amid triumph, the empire's destiny was already entangled in future strife. Seleucus anchored his western presence by founding Antioch on the Orontes River. Conceived as both capital and showcase, it soon blossomed into one of the great cities of the ancient world. Broad avenues cut through bustling quarters, temples crowned hilltops, and theatres echoed with voices speaking Greek, Aramaic, and Phoenician. Colonists from Macedonia joined local elites, creating a civic identity that blended Hellenistic ambition with Syrian tradition. Antioch would endure as the jewel of the Seleucid crown, rival to Alexandria, a place where East met West in stone and law. Further settlements reinforced his power. Apamea, named for his Sogdian queen, Apamea, stood as a reminder of his family's fusion of cultures. Laodicea and Seleucia Pieria, coastal ports linked to Antioch, formed a network binding hinterlands to the sea. Through these foundations, Seleucus not only projected authority, but embedded permanence. Cities were his monuments, living garrisons of settlers who would defend the dynasty long after soldiers had marched on. Even in matters of family, Seleucus made choices that shaped succession. He married Stratonides, daughter of Demetrius, binding former enemies to his line. Yet the union took an unexpected turn when his son Antiochus fell into lovesick despair for his young stepmother. Physicians, fearing his illness would claim him, revealed the truth. In a gesture both pragmatic and shocking, Seleucus surrendered Stratonius to his son, preserving Antiochus' life and securing loyalty in a single stroke. Rather than scandal, the act became legend, a tale of royal sacrifice told in courts from Syria to Greece. In Asia Minor, rivalries simmered with Lysimachus. The Thracian king controlled the western coasts, eyeing Anatolia with suspicion as Seleucus strengthened his grip on central territories. For a time, diplomacy preserved peace, but both rulers knew collision was inevitable. Between them stretched lands, rich in cities and trade routes, each pass and valley coveted by both monarchs. Meanwhile, Seleucus's reputation as a monarch of vision grew. He maintained Babylon's sanctuaries, minted coins that fused Greek portraiture with Eastern symbols, and held court with nobles from every corner of his empire. His rule balanced conquest with conciliation, presenting himself as successor not only to Alexander, but to Cyrus and Darius. In this multicultural legitimacy lay the strength of his dynasty, at least for now. The years after Ipsus brought further victories. Seleucus extended influence toward the Aegean, negotiated alliances, and held together a realm that spanned more miles than any single successor could boast. Yet success carried its dangers. Allies became rivals as soon as Antigonus lay dead, and among the coalition, trust frayed. Ptolemy and Seleucus quarreled over Syria. Cassander, aging and embattled in Macedon, watched his power weaken. Lysimachus plotted in Thrace. The successor kingdoms had hardened into permanent monarchies, their rivalries ensuring that Alexander's dream of unity was gone forever. In 281 BC, the simmering tension reached its inevitable conclusion. At Corypadium in Lydia, Seleucus and Lysimachus clashed. The battle was fierce, fought with veterans who had served since Alexander's days. men who carried scars older than their grandsons. Lysimachus, now over 70, fought with vigor, but met his end upon the field. With his death, Seleucus stood poised to claim Macedonia itself. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that the old bodyguard of Alexander might reunite his homeland with the Eastern Empire he had carved. Yet triumph turned to tragedy. As he prepared to cross into Europe, Seleucus was struck down by assassination. Ptolemy Karaunos, son of Ptolemy in Egypt and guest at his court, murdered him near Lysimachia. The killer fled to claim Macedon for himself, leaving Seleucus dead at 77. Thus ended the life of the man who had begun as Alexander's shield-bearer, endured exile, and risen to rule more of Asia than any other successor. His death cast long shadows. The house of Seleucus now passed to his son, Antiochus I, who would inherit not only an empire, but also the burden of defending it from all sides. The triumph of Ipsus, the foundations of Antioch, the elephants from India, all these were legacies, but they came paired with rivalries, disputes, and the curse of ambition that haunted every inheritor of Alexander's mantle. Seleucus's body returned east, his memory honored as both conqueror and founder. Cities bore his name, coins carried his likeness, and temples recorded his rule alongside kings of Persia and Babylon. He had outlived nearly all of Alexander's companions, and in the end he stood closest to reuniting their scattered conquests. Yet fate intervened, leaving his work incomplete and his heirs to grapple with the impossible task of holding together a realm born from both vision and chance. Seleucus I's assassination in 281 BC left his son, Antiochus, facing an empire that spanned from Anatolia to the frontiers of India but lacked secure foundations. The moment of triumph at Corypedium vanished into uncertainty as the dynasty's founder lay dead, leaving behind a realm both vast and vulnerable. Antiochus inherited his throne not in celebration, but amid shock, with rivals watching closely for weakness. The new king had not been expected to rule so soon. Seleucus, vigorous even in his later years, had planned to claim Macedon himself, while Antiochus served as co-ruler in the east. Now the young monarch stood alone, carrying the burden of his father's ambitions while facing threats that came from every direction. Lysimachus's lands in Asia Minor, newly conquered, were restless. Galatian tribes pressed across Anatolia, plundering cities and demanding tribute. To the south, Ptolemy II of Egypt waited for the first opportunity to seize Coele-Syria, renewing a dispute that had begun in the aftermath of Ipsus. Antiochus's first challenge came from the north. In the years following Corypedium, waves of Celtic tribes crossed from the Balkans into Asia Minor. These Galatians, as the Greeks called them, carved out footholds in the highlands, threatening both Seleucid settlements and local dynasts. Their cavalry charges and ferocious war bands unsettled the carefully balanced structures his father had left. Antiochus chose to confront them directly. Around 275 BC, he brought elephants into battle, using them as living bulwarks against the wild charges of Galatian infantry. The result was decisive. The elephants panicked the enemy, scattering them and securing a rare victory that earned Antiochus the title Soter, the Savior. For decades afterward, the battle was remembered as proof that elephants could blunt the shock of Celtic warfare. Securing Anatolia was only part of his task. To the south, Ptolemaic forces were on the move. The First Syrian War broke out around 274 BC, when Ptolemy II advanced into Coele-Syria. This region, stretching from Lebanon to Judea, was the fault line between Seleucid and Ptolemaic ambitions. Armies clashed near Damascus, and cities shifted allegiance according to which king's forces were closer. The war proved inconclusive, Antiochus could not dislodge the Egyptians permanently, but neither could Ptolemy drive the Seleucids from their holdings. When peace was declared around 271 BSC, borders remained largely unchanged, but the conflict established a pattern. Syria would become the arena where Seleucids and Ptolemies tested their strength again and again. Antiochus understood that survival required more than victories in the field. He needed to hold together a realm stretched thin by distance and diversity. To that end, he reinforced the fortress lines that guarded key passes, particularly those linking Mesopotamia to Anatolia and Syria. Garrisons were stationed along major roads, and caravan routes were patrolled to ensure merchants could move without fear of raids. Taxes collected from these routes provided the treasury with lifeblood, and the protection of trade tied cities more firmly to his rule. In Babylon, Antiochus restored the privileges of ancient temples. Cylinder seals record his dedication of resources to the Asagala, the great sanctuary of Marduk. By doing so, he positioned himself not merely as a Macedonian conqueror, but as legitimate successor to Achaemenid kings. The Babylonian priesthood, whose records stretched back centuries, accepted him into their continuity of rulers. For the people of Mesopotamia, Antiochus was not only the heir of Seleucus, but also a guardian of sacred traditions. This dual identity, Greek king and Babylonian monarch, allowed the Seleucid dynasty to endure in lands where foreign conquerors had often been rejected. Dynastic marriages further secured his position. Antiochus arranged alliances in western Anatolia, binding local rulers to his dynasty through marriage ties. His own family reflected the blending of traditions begun by his father. His mother, Apamea, remained a respected presence at court, symbolizing the union of Macedonian conquest and Iranian nobility. Such gestures reassured Eastern elites that their place in the empire was secure, even as Greek settlers continued to dominate new foundations in Syria and Mesopotamia. Court ritual reinforced this legitimacy. Antiochus cultivated the image of a ruler, accessible yet elevated, appearing in processions where Greek soldiers marched beside Eastern contingents. Festivals combined Hellenistic and local practices, with sacrifices offered to Zeus alongside offerings to Babylonian gods. These performances projected stability, suggesting that despite wars and threats, the empire remained intact under a king who honored both halves of his inheritance. Nevertheless, Antiochus ruled with caution. The defeat of Galatians and the stalemate in Syria showed that his resources were limited. He inherited a realm too large for any one ruler to command with ease, and his reign became a constant balancing act between defense and consolidation. He lacked the means to push westward into Greece or to reclaim India, but he preserved what his father had left, ensuring the empire did not collapse under the weight of its contradictions. The shadow of Ptolemy II loomed large throughout his reign. Egypt's wealth and naval strength threatened the Seleucid coastlines, and although peace followed the First Syrian War, neither dynasty trusted the other. Antiochus reinforced his western cities, especially Antioch and Seleucia Pieria, preparing for renewed conflict that everyone knew would come. His efforts created a defensive belt that would serve his successors in later wars. In the east, Seleucid authority remained more nominal than real. Bactria and Parthia accepted Seleucid suzerainty, but functioned with considerable autonomy. Tribute flowed irregularly, and local rulers often acted independently, though they still acknowledged Antiochus's supremacy. His limited ability to intervene revealed the constraints of Seleucid power. The empire was immense, but its reach often depended on cooperation rather than direct control. Antiochus's reign was not one of dramatic conquest, but of survival through pragmatism. He fought when necessary, negotiated when prudent, and preserved the structures his father had built. The elephants that had saved him against the Galatians became enduring symbols of Seleucid strength, while his support of temples in Babylon signaled continuity with ancient traditions. His marriage policies and court rituals ensured that both Greek settlers and Eastern elites found places in his monarchy. By the end of his 20-year reign, the empire remained intact, though tested on every frontier. Antiochus died in 261 BC, leaving his son, Antiochus II, to inherit the throne. The young king would face a more aggressive Ptolemaic rival and the consequences of unresolved disputes in Syria. The legacy of Antiochus I was neither dramatic expansion nor humiliating defeat, but something subtler. He proved the Seleucid Empire could be held together despite its unwieldy size and constant threats. He earned the title Soter, not only for one battlefield victory, but for preserving a fragile empire through 2 decades of storms. When Antiochus I died in 261 BC, his son Antiochus II inherited a realm already under pressure. The Seleucid Empire stretched across thousands of miles, but its resources were limited and its neighbors restless. Ptolemy II of Egypt had not abandoned the dream of controlling Coele-Syria, and the war that soon erupted between the 2 dynasties would dominate the new king's reign. The Second Syrian War began almost immediately after Antiochus II's accession. Ptolemy launched attacks along the coasts of Asia Minor, while Seleucid forces advanced southward through Syria and Palestine. Cities such as Miletus and Ephesus saw the arrival of Seleucid troops, and many communities shifted allegiance to Antiochus when he promised liberation from Egyptian control. Greek cities along the coast hailed him as a benefactor, granting him the title Theos, the god, for restoring their autonomy. Divine honors in the Greek world were rare for living rulers, but Antiochus accepted them, strengthening his prestige in Asia Minor, even as the war drained resources. The conflict with Egypt was not only fought with armies, but also with marriages. To secure peace, Antiochus II was compelled to divorce his queen, Laodice, and marry Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy II. The arrangement was meant to seal a fragile peace between the rival dynasties. Berenice arrived in Antioch with a massive dowry, her presence a visible reminder of Egyptian power in the Seleucid court. The settlement also required Antiochus to disinherit Laodice's children in favor of any heirs born to Berenice. This agreement destabilized the royal household. Laodice, who had long played a central role in the Seleucid court, refused to accept her demotion quietly. She retained powerful allies among the nobility and provincial governors, men whose loyalty had been cultivated during her years as queen. Antiochus II found himself caught between 2 households, one backed by Egyptian gold, the other rooted in long-standing Seleucid traditions. While royal intrigues unfolded, the war with Egypt shifted in momentum. Seleucid armies achieved victories in Asia Minor, but Ptolemaic fleets maintained dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Neither side could secure a decisive advantage, and by 253 BC peace was arranged. Antiochus remained married to Berenice, but Laodice's position continued to influence the court. The uneasy balance left the empire divided at its core, with succession disputes inevitable. Administration during these years reflected the instability of the throne. Satraps in the east governed with increasing independence, often acting without direct oversight from Antioch. In Bactria and Parthia, local governors minted coins and commanded troops as though they were kings in waiting. Although they continued to acknowledge Seleucid overlordship, Their autonomy foreshadowed the eventual fragmentation of the empire. Antiochus attempted to reassert authority, but his attention remained fixed on the west, where Egyptian rivalry consumed his resources. Laodices's position strengthened as Antiochus aged. Sources suggest that by the mid-240s BC he returned to her household, perhaps because her sons represented a more secure line of succession than Berenice's young child. The decision proved fatal. In 246 BC, Antiochus II died suddenly, and ancient writers accused Laodice of orchestrating his poisoning. Whether or not she was directly responsible, events that followed confirmed her determination to secure power for her own family. Laodice moved swiftly after his death. She declared her son Seleucus II as king, placing him on the throne in Antioch while eliminating rivals. Berenice and her infant son were murdered, an act that shocked contemporaries and provoked Egypt's wrath. Ptolemy III, brother of Berenice, launched a massive invasion to avenge her death, sparking the Third Syrian War. The decisions of Antiochus II's household thus plunged the empire into one of its gravest crises. The reaction of city elites and satraps revealed how fragile Seleucid legitimacy had become. Some communities, disgusted by the murders, looked favorably upon Egyptian intervention. Others remained loyal to Laodice's faction, hoping stability would follow her decisive actions. Mercenary captains and local governors began acting as independent powers, collecting taxes and dispensing justice in their own names. The unity that Seleucus I had built and Antiochus I had preserved was now visibly fracturing. Culturally, Antiochus II's reign continued the blending of traditions that characterized Seleucid rule. Coins from his era depict both Greek gods and local symbols, signaling attempts to appeal across populations. Civic charters granted privileges to Greek cities, while Babylonian temples continued to receive royal support. Yet beneath the surface of continuity lay growing discontent. Eastern satrapies sensed weakness, while Western territories experienced constant tug-of-war between Seleucid and Ptolemaic forces. The story of Antiochus II is remembered less for conquest than for the entanglements of family politics. His marriage to Berenice, though arranged to secure peace, ultimately destroyed stability. His reliance on Laodice after years of estrangement brought a dynasty into crisis. His acceptance of divine honors in Asia Minor reflected success in one region. But the murder of his Egyptian wife and child exposed the fragility of royal authority across the empire. By 246 BC, the Seleucid realm stood on the brink of chaos. Antiochus II's death left behind not a secure dynasty, but two competing claims to the throne. Laodice's son, Seleucus II, claimed legitimacy through blood and long-established support. Berenice's murdered son represented the promise of peace with Egypt, a promise extinguished in violence. The murders transformed dynastic rivalry into open war, drawing the Ptolemies deep into the heart of Seleucid territory. The Laodicean Tangle, as later historians described it, revealed the dangers of royal marriages used as political weapons. What had begun as a strategy to end the Second Syrian War ended instead in civil strife, foreign invasion, and succession crisis. Antiochus II's reign, which had once seemed to promise stability through diplomacy, closed with bloodshed that threatened the empire's very survival. The sudden death of Antiochus II in 246 BC left his son Seleucus II, later called Callinicus, to claim the throne in Antioch. His position was far from secure. The murders of Berenice and her infant son had enraged Egypt and Ptolemy III responded with a lightning campaign that shook the Seleucid Empire to its core. The Third Syrian War opened with Egyptian armies, pushing deep into Seleucid territory. Ptolemy III advanced through Coele-Syria and Phoenicia, welcomed by cities that remembered his sister Berenice and despised Laodice's faction. He marched into Mesopotamia, and some records suggest his forces reached as far as Babylon, and perhaps even beyond, where local scribes briefly acknowledged him as king. For a few years, it seemed as though the Seleucid Empire might collapse entirely, its richest provinces falling under Egyptian control. Seleucus II struggled to respond. His resources were limited, and many local governors hesitated to commit themselves while the outcome remained uncertain. Temples were looted, treasuries emptied, and morale shattered. The once proud dynasty found itself defending not expansion, but survival. Eventually, Ptolemy withdrew, driven by rebellion at home and the impossibility of holding so vast a conquest. Still, the damage was lasting. The Seleucid East, already semi-autonomous, began slipping away for good. Around the same time, in 247 BC, a man named Anabasis seized Parthia. Once a minor satrapy under Seleucid control, it now became the base of a new dynasty. The Arsacid rulers, later known as the Parthians, began their rise during this chaos. At first, Seleucid kings may have seen their rebellion as a temporary nuisance, but it proved to be the beginning of a power that would eventually replace them. In Bactria, another satrap took advantage of the disorder. Diodotus, governor of the region, declared independence and founded what became the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. His successors consolidated this independence, turning Bactria into a wealthy and ambitious state. The rich farmland and strategic trade routes along the Silk Road ensured its prosperity. Once lost, these territories would never return to direct Seleucid control. The Seleucid dynasty was not only threatened from the outside. Internal strife worsened the situation. Antiochus Hierax, younger brother of Seleucus II, carved out power in Asia Minor. Initially entrusted as regent in the west, he soon declared himself king, allying with Galatian tribes and local dynasts against his elder brother. The two brothers fought bitterly, draining resources that should have been used to defend the empire's frontiers. One of the most dramatic clashes came at Ancyra in the 240s BC. Antiochus Hierax, backed by Galatian warriors, inflicted a humiliating defeat on Seleucus. For a time, Hierax controlled much of Western Asia Minor, effectively splitting the empire in two. This civil war demonstrated how fragile Seleucid authority had become. A dynasty that once dreamed of ruling Alexander's entire inheritance now fought among itself for fragments. Financial strain deepened the crisis. With revenues from the east cut off and wars draining the treasury, Seleucus debased coinage and fell into arrears with soldiers and mercenaries. Loyalty grew uncertain when wages went unpaid, and satraps increasingly turned to their own resources to sustain garrisons. What had once been a coherent empire now looked like a loose collection of territories held together by tradition more than by force. Despite the hardships Seleucus II endured for over 20 years, he never regained full control of Asia Minor, nor did he recover Bactria or Parthia, but he preserved the dynasty's core lands in Mesopotamia and Syria. His reign revealed the limits of Seleucid power. The empire was too vast, its frontiers too exposed, and its resources too thinly stretched to withstand simultaneous invasions, rebellions, and family rivalries. By the time of his death in 225 BC, the Seleucid Empire was visibly weakened. Its eastern territories had slipped away permanently, Asia Minor remained divided, and Egypt still controlled much of Coele-Syria. Yet the dynasty survived, largely because no single rival could replace it outright. The Parthians and Bactrians were strong locally, but not yet ready to challenge the West. The Ptolemies were powerful, but faced their own internal troubles. The Seleucid state staggered, but did not fall. Seleucus II left the throne to his sons, first Seleucus III, and then Antiochus III, who would attempt to restore what had been lost. His reign is remembered not for expansion, but for contraction, a period when the empire fractured and new powers rose from its edges. The Seleucid kings had inherited Alexander's dream of universal empire, but under Seleucus II that dream splintered, leaving behind a state forced to reckon with limits it could no longer ignore. Seleucus II left behind two sons to carry on the dynasty. The elder, Seleucus III, came to the throne in 225 BC. His reign was brief, lasting scarcely 3 years, and it revealed just how precarious Seleucid authority had become. Seleucus III launched campaigns in Asia Minor, determined to recover territories lost during the struggles with his uncle Antiochus Hierax. Yet his ambitions outran his resources. Supplies were scarce, loyalty uncertain, and rival dynasts entrenched. While leading a campaign in the interior, he was assassinated by officers who had lost faith in his leadership. His sudden death created yet another moment of crisis for a dynasty already staggering. The throne now passed to his younger brother, Antiochus III. Barely 20 years old when crowned in 223 BC, he inherited not only the crown, but also the daunting challenge of restoring authority over a realm fractured by civil war and invasion. Youth could have been a liability, yet Antiochus combined energy with determination. His reign would stretch for more than 3 decades, and he would later be remembered as Antiochus the Great. Almost immediately, Antiochus faced revolt. Molon, satrap of Media, refused to accept the new king's authority. Alongside his brother, Alexander, in Persia, Molon gathered support from disaffected satraps and proclaimed independence. For a time, his rebellion threatened the very heart of the empire. Antiochus's first generals failed against Molon, suffering defeats that emboldened the rebels. Rumors spread that Babylon itself might fall. The young king realized he could not entrust this crisis to subordinates. In 220 BC, he marched east himself, personally leading the campaign against Molon. His determination bore fruit. Antiochus's forces crushed the rebels, and Molon took his own life rather than submit. The victory restored confidence in the monarchy. By showing that the central authority could still suppress rebellion, Antiochus proved that youth was no barrier to effective rule. While Antiochus fought in the east, trouble brewed in the west. Achaeus, a cousin of the royal family, had been left as governor in Asia Minor. At first, he remained loyal, defeating Pergamene rivals and securing Seleucid control. But in 220 BC, he declared himself king, claiming independence over large portions of Asia Minor. His defection added another fracture to the empire, forcing Antiochus to balance threats on multiple fronts. The new king responded by reorganizing his court. Old ministers associated with failure were dismissed, and new advisors brought in. Royal processions across the empire reminded subjects of his presence and authority. These journeys were more than ceremonial. They reassured cities and satraps that the king was active, visible, and determined to enforce order. The combination of reform and display reinforced Antiochus's legitimacy at a time when rebellion seemed contagious. Attention soon turned to the south, where the long rivalry with Egypt flared again. In 219 BC, Antiochus moved to reclaim Coele-Syria, the contested region stretching from Lebanon to Judea. For decades, this land had been the battleground between Seleucid and Ptolemaic ambitions. Antiochus believed his restored strength offered the chance to win what his father and grandfather had failed to secure. The opening campaigns of what became the Fourth Syrian War revealed both his ambition and his challenges. Seleucid armies advanced quickly, seizing cities and fortresses. Yet Egypt, under Ptolemy IV, was not unprepared. The Egyptians gathered one of the largest armies in their history, including a surprising innovation: thousands of native Egyptian infantry trained in the Macedonian style of warfare. This development shocked Greek observers who had long assumed Egyptians were unfit for heavy infantry service. In 217 BC, the two armies met at Raphia near Gaza. Antiochus III commanded some 73,000 troops, while Ptolemy IV fielded around 75,000. The battle was fierce, with elephants clashing and phalanxes grinding against one another in dust and heat. Antiochus fought with courage, personally leading cavalry charges that broke parts of the Egyptian line. But discipline among his infantry faltered, and the native Egyptian phalanx held firm. In the end, the Seleucid army was routed. Antiochus was forced to retreat, abandoning his conquests. The defeat at Raphia was catastrophic. It not only denied him Coele-Syria, but also emboldened rebels across the empire. The sight of Egyptians defeating a Seleucid army convinced many that the dynasty's power was waning. Antiochus recognized the danger. Rather than collapse into despair, he chose a different path. If the West could not yet be secured, then the East must be restored. By regaining the satrapies of Iran and Central Asia, he hoped to rebuild his strength, gather resources, and return to challenge Egypt from a position of power. The decision marked a turning point. Antiochus's next campaigns, often called his Anabasis or Eastern Expedition, would not only recover lost territories, but also redefine the character of his reign. He would march through Media, Parthia, and Bactria, blending conquest with diplomacy, demanding tribute where he could not impose direct rule, and reasserting Seleucid presence in lands abandoned since the chaos of Seleucus II's reign. These campaigns would provide him with fresh troops, elephants, and revenues, resources he needed to resume the struggle for Syria. By 219 BC, Antiochus stood at a crossroads. He had shown himself capable of defeating rebels, reorganizing the court, and rallying loyalty. Yet the defeat at Raphia underscored the fragility of Seleucid power. His ambition to restore Alexander's vision was intact, but the path forward required patience and persistence. In the years ahead, Antiochus would prove that renewal was possible, though the victories he achieved would always carry the shadow of eventual decline. After the defeat at Raphia in 217 BC, Antiochus III faced a choice. He could continue exhausting wars with Egypt while the empire crumbled, or he could turn east and attempt to restore the heartlands abandoned during decades of weakness. He chose the second path. The decision was bold, for no Seleucid king since Seleucus I had attempted to reassert authority across the Iranian plateau and beyond. The years that followed became known as his Anabasis, a campaign that mixed conquest, diplomacy, and spectacle, designed to remind the world that the Seleucid Empire was not finished. The march began in 212 BC with a campaign against restless satraps in Media and Persis. These regions, rich in resources and strategic position, had been drifting toward autonomy. Antiochus advanced with a reorganized army that included phalanxes, cavalry, and elephants, demonstrating his determination to impose order. Cities opened their gates when offered favorable terms, while garrisons that resisted were reduced quickly. The message was clear. The king would not allow provincial independence to stand unchallenged. From Media, he moved into Parthia and Hyrcania, where our Sassanid kings had begun building the state that would one day eclipse the Seleucids. Antiochus confronted them with both force and negotiation. Some strongholds fell after sieges, others submitted when offered recognition of local authority under Seleucid overlordship. The result was a compromise. Parthia retained internal independence but agreed to pay tribute. For Antiochus, this was sufficient. He lacked the resources to hold every valley directly, but he re-established the principle that Eastern kings acknowledged his supremacy. Hyrcania, with its fertile lands on the Caspian coast, provided much-needed supplies. Antiochus staged ceremonies in which local elites pledged loyalty before Greek and Persian audiences alike. These rituals emphasized continuity with both Alexander and the Achaemenid kings, blending traditions to appeal across cultures. Such acts reassured the Eastern nobility that the Seleucid dynasty still commanded legitimacy, even after decades of neglect. Further east lay Bactria, the most formidable of the breakaway satrapies. Diodotus I had declared independence a generation earlier, and his successor Euthydemus now ruled as king in his own right. Antiochus advanced into the region around 208 BC, demanding submission. Euthydemus resisted, and the two armies met near the river Arius. The battle raged for hours, with Seleucid cavalry pressing hard, but Bactrian elephants holding firm. Antiochus himself fought at the front, his horse slain beneath him. Though wounded, he rallied his men, preventing disaster. The struggle ended without a decisive result, and Euthydemus withdrew behind the walls of Bactra. The siege of Bactra lasted nearly 2 years, from 208 to 206 BC. Antiochus blockaded the city, cutting supply lines and pressing for surrender. Yet Euthydemus's defenses held, and his cavalry continued to raid the besiegers. Eventually, negotiations replaced combat. Both rulers recognized the futility of endless struggle. Antiochus agreed to acknowledge Euthydemus as king of Bactria, while Euthydemus pledged loyalty and provided tribute. To seal the accord, Antiochus accepted a marriage alliance. His daughter would wed Euthydemus's son, Demetrius. The agreement secured peace and bound Bactria to the Seleucid orbit, even as it remained effectively independent. This outcome, though not a conquest, strengthened Antiochus. The siege had demonstrated his persistence and power, while the treaty gave him new allies. Most importantly, he acquired more elephants, over 150 according to ancient sources. These beasts, transported westward, would later play a decisive role in his renewed wars with Egypt. From Bactria, the king turned south toward the Persian Gulf. Control of ports and caravan routes there was essential for commerce. Local rulers, long accustomed to autonomy, were compelled to acknowledge Seleucid supremacy. Antiochus refounded several cities, granting privileges and exemptions that encouraged loyalty. Customs revenues from the Gulf enriched his treasury, while secure harbors allowed Seleucid merchants to trade with Arabia and India. The Anabasis was not only military. Antiochus cultivated loyalty with spectacle. He presided over processions that displayed elephants, cavalry, and captured tribute. He refounded cities with Greek names, reinforcing Hellenistic identity while honoring local gods in ceremonies that recalled older traditions. Coins minted during these campaigns spread his image throughout the East, reminding distant subjects that a living monarch commanded their allegiance. By 205 BC, Antiochus returned west with renewed strength. The eastern Satrapies once again acknowledged Seleucid authority. Tribute flowed into the treasury, and his army was reinforced with elephants and fresh recruits. The campaign had lasted nearly a decade, but its results transformed the balance of power. What had seemed like a declining kingdom after Raphia now appeared revived. Antiochus's return was celebrated in the style of a great king. He adopted ceremonies that consciously echoed Alexander's triumphs and the grandeur of Persian monarchs. Cities along his route greeted him with processions, and envoys arrived from distant lands to offer congratulations. To his subjects, Antiochus appeared as a conqueror who had restored the empire's dignity. To his enemies, he was once again a dangerous rival. The revenues collected from the east allowed him to reorganize finances. Satraps were reminded of their obligations. Coinage was standardized, and soldiers received long-delayed pay. The prestige of the Eastern campaign also silenced internal opposition. Achaeus in Asia Minor, once a major threat, lost much of his support when Antiochus returned in triumph. The king's authority, though not unchallenged, seemed more secure than at any time since his grandfather's reign. The Anabasis, however, did not erase the empire's structural weaknesses. Parthia and Bactria remained effectively independent, bound by treaties rather than by garrisons. Local dynasts could still act on their own initiative, and satrapal loyalty rested on Antiochus's personal strength rather than enduring institutions. Yet the campaign demonstrated that the Seleucid dynasty was still capable of commanding respect across an enormous territory. Antiochus now turned his eyes once again toward Coele-Syria. Egypt remained weakened by internal strife after the death of Ptolemy III. His successor, Ptolemy IV, was less formidable, and Antiochus saw opportunity. The elephants from Bactria and tribute from the east gave him resources for renewed war. In 202 BC, he prepared to invade, beginning what would become the Fifth Syrian War. The Anabasis had begun as a response to defeat and humiliation. It ended with Antiochus III restored as a monarch of stature, wealthier and more confident than before. The campaign revealed his strengths: persistence, pragmatism, and the ability to combine force with diplomacy. He had not reconquered Alexander's empire, but he had reminded the world that the Seleucid kings remained heirs to that vision. When Antiochus returned to Antioch in triumph, his court and people hailed him as the Great. The title reflected not only victories in the east, but the perception that the dynasty had been renewed. For a generation raised amid civil war and foreign invasions, the Anabasis symbolized stability regained. Antiochus had given his empire time, money, and prestige, resources soon to be tested on the battlefields of Coele-Syria. The return from the eastern campaigns had given Antiochus the third wealth, elephants, and prestige, but none of these mattered as much as what lay to the south. Coele-Syria remained the disputed frontier, a region both Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Empire considered vital. Fertile plains, wealthy ports, and the road to Judea made the land a strategic prize. Antiochus had tried and failed to take it before. Now, strengthened by his Anabasis, he prepared to strike again. Egypt presented an inviting target. Ptolemy IV had died, leaving the throne to his young son, Ptolemy V, a child scarcely more than a figurehead. Regents and courtiers controlled the government in Alexandria, and factional disputes undermined Egyptian strength. Antiochus judged the moment ripe. He allied himself with Philip V of Macedon, who sought his own gains in the Aegean, and marched south with the confidence of a man who had restored his empire's fortunes. The campaign opened with rapid advances through Phoenicia. Cities that had long chafed under Ptolemaic rule welcomed the Seleucid king. Sidon and Tyre saw his banners raised, while inland fortresses yielded after brief resistance. Antiochus rewarded cooperation with privileges and tax relief, binding urban elites to his cause. His army, reinforced with elephants from Bactria and veterans from the eastern campaigns, pressed toward the key battleground. The decisive moment came at Panion in 200 BC. Ptolemaic forces, under the general Scopas, attempted to hold mountain passes north of the Jordan River. Antiochus personally led his cavalry, striking the Egyptian flank with precision. The clash of elephants decided the day. Seleucid beasts advanced steadily, while their opponents faltered, opening gaps for phalanxes to exploit. Scopus's army broke, retreating to Sidon in disorder. The victory at Panion ended decades of stalemate. Coele-Syria now lay in Seleucid hands. The aftermath reshaped the region. Judea, caught between empires for generations, shifted firmly under Seleucid rule. Antiochus confirmed privileges for the Jewish population, granting exemptions for temple revenues and allowing them to live according to the laws of their ancestors. These concessions fostered loyalty, establishing a relationship that endured for decades. For Jerusalem's priesthood, the Seleucid king appeared as a benefactor rather than a conqueror, in sharp contrast to the crises that would erupt later under Antiochus IV. Sidon, where Scopas and the remnants of his army retreated, became the stage for another triumph. Antiochus besieged the city, cutting off supplies until surrender became inevitable. The defeat of Scopas destroyed the last major Egyptian field force in the region. Alexandria could not mount another serious campaign, leaving Antiochus master of the prize his father and grandfather had sought without success. Control of Coele-Syria brought not only prestige, but also revenue. Its agricultural wealth filled royal treasuries, while ports along the coast expanded Seleucid influence in the eastern Mediterranean. Antiochus installed loyal garrisons and reorganized tax farms, ensuring steady income for the crown. Cities that had long been under Egyptian rule were integrated into the Seleucid framework, with civic institutions adjusted to mirror those of Antioch and Seleucia. Victory did not go unnoticed abroad. Rome, fresh from defeating Carthage, sent envoys to observe Antiochus's expansion. The Seleucid king received them with ceremony, projecting the image of a monarch whose power could not be ignored. For the moment, relations remained diplomatic, but Roman attention was a warning that expansion into the Aegean might provoke confrontation. While Rome watched, Antiochus secured peace with Egypt through marriage diplomacy. Around 193 BC, he gave his daughter Cleopatra in marriage to Ptolemy V. The union was presented as reconciliation, but in practice it ensured Seleucid dominance. Cleopatra carried no dowry of territory, and the conquered lands remained firmly in Antiochus's hands. By binding the two dynasties, he removed Egypt as an immediate threat, while keeping Coele-Syria under Seleucid control. The capture of Coele-Syria also transformed Antiochus's relationship with his subjects. Cities across the empire hailed him as the Great King, a title evoking both Persian tradition and Alexander's legacy. Processions in Antioch displayed elephants, tribute, and captives, reinforcing the aura of triumph. His prestige reached a height no Seleucid ruler had known since Seleucus I. Internal consolidation followed. Satraps were reminded of their obligations, and royal decrees standardized practices across the empire. Eastern cities minted coins bearing Antiochus's portrait, while Greek communities in Asia Minor renewed loyalty. The empire, long fragmented, now seemed coherent under a single will. Still, The gains of the Fifth Syrian War carried risks. Egypt had been humbled but not destroyed. Its navy remained powerful, and its wealth ensured that future kings would try to reclaim what had been lost. More immediately, Rome's interest in Eastern affairs grew sharper. Antiochus's alliance with Philip V had already drawn Roman suspicion, and his victories in Syria suggested he might turn his ambitions toward Greece. For now, those questions waited, but they would soon dominate the final decades of his reign. For Antiochus himself, the triumph marked the zenith of his career. He had overcome defeat at Raphia, restored the empire through the Anabasis, and delivered the decisive blow at Panion. Cities celebrated him, allies feared him, and rivals grudgingly respected him. To his supporters, he appeared as the rightful heir of Alexander, master of lands stretching from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush. The years immediately following Panion were years of consolidation rather than expansion. Garrisons secured Syria, tax collectors gathered revenues, and cities adjusted to their new overlords. In Antioch, the court flourished with embassies from across the Mediterranean, eager to acknowledge the power of the king who had risen from near defeat to unrivaled prominence. What had begun as a gamble, a renewed attempt on Coele-Syria after earlier failures, ended as a resounding success. Antiochus had not only won territory, but had transformed the balance of power in the east. The Seleucid Empire now seemed unassailable, its ruler more secure than any since the dynasty's founder. Yet history rarely allows such moments to last. The victory at Panion and the marriage alliance with Egypt stabilized the southern frontier, but new horizons beckoned. Antiochus looked westward, toward Asia Minor and Greece, where opportunities and dangers awaited. His triumph in Syria would soon bring him into collision with Rome, a power rising with relentless momentum. For the Seleucid Empire, the capture of Coele-Syria marked both fulfillment and turning point, the culmination of generations of struggle, and the beginning of challenges that would test whether even Antiochus the Great could hold what he had won. The conquest of Coele-Syria gave Antiochus III confidence, but it also drew his gaze toward the west. The Aegean world had entered a new phase after Rome's victory over Carthage. Greek states were divided between those who welcomed Roman influence and those who sought protection under older monarchies. Antiochus believed he could extend Seleucid authority into Asia Minor, and perhaps even into Greece itself, where Macedonian kings had once ruled. His first steps came in Anatolia. Cities long neglected by the Seleucids welcomed his presence when he promised autonomy and tax relief. Royal processions through Phrygia and Lydia projected power, while alliances with local dynasts secured the mountain passes. To many Greeks, Antiochus appeared as a liberator from petty tyrants. His reputation as the Great grew, and embassies invited him to play a larger role in Hellenic affairs. The situation in Greece itself soon drew him further. The Aetolian League, resentful of Roman interference, sought his help. Its leaders portrayed Antiochus as the champion of Greek freedom, a king who could restore autonomy to states threatened by foreign domination. Antiochus, eager to claim the mantle of Alexander in Europe, accepted the invitation. In 192 BC, he crossed into Greece with a modest force, expecting to be joined by mass defections. Support, however, proved weaker than anticipated. Many Greek cities hesitated, remembering the devastation of past wars and fearing Roman retaliation. Even Philip V of Macedon, once Antiochus's ally, remained cautious after his own defeat at Roman hands. The Seleucid king found himself with fewer allies than he had hoped. facing an opponent far more disciplined than the scattered Greek states. In 191 BC, Rome responded decisively. At Thermopylae, the very pass where Leonidas had once resisted Persia, Antiochus attempted to block the Roman advance. The symbolism was striking, but the outcome was disastrous. Roman forces flanked the position, aided by local guides, and the Seleucid army broke. Antiochus withdrew to Asia, abandoning Greece and the dream of restoring Macedonian-style dominion there. The Romans did not stop at the Aegean. They followed Antiochus into Asia Minor, where their fleet, supported by Rhodes and Pergamon, challenged Seleucid control of the seas. In 190 BC, at the naval battle of Myonnesus, Antiochus's fleet suffered a crushing defeat. Without naval supremacy, he could not protect his coasts or supply his armies effectively. The decisive confrontation came later that year at Magnesia, near Sardis. Antiochus mustered more than 70,000 troops, including his prized elephants and heavily armed phalanxes. The Romans, with Pergamene allies, fielded about 40,000. The battle began with confidence on the Seleucid side, but discipline and flexibility favored Rome. Antiochus's elephants, once his greatest strength, became a liability. Startled and uncontrollable, they trampled friendly lines, spreading panic. Roman legions exploited the chaos, breaking through and routing the Seleucid host. Antiochus fled, his dream of Western conquest shattered. Defeat forced negotiation, and Rome dictated terms at Apamea in 188 BC. The treaty was harsh. Antiochus surrendered all territories north of the Taurus Mountains, effectively abandoning Asia Minor. He agreed to deliver his elephants and limit his navy to a token force. Most damaging of all, he accepted a massive indemnity, 15,000 talents of silver, to be paid over 12 years. The figure represented nearly a tenth of the empire's annual revenue for more than a decade. Hostages, including his son Antiochus IV, were sent to Rome to guarantee compliance. The consequences of Apamea were profound. The Seleucid Empire lost not only land, but also its ability to project power in the west. Pergamon and Rhodes, allies of Rome, gained territory and influence, becoming regional powers that could challenge Seleucid authority. Without elephants or a strong navy, Antiochus's military machine was crippled. His treasury, drained by indemnities, could no longer sustain ambitious campaigns. For the king himself, the humiliation was bitter. He had once been hailed as the great king, conqueror of the East and victor at Panion. Now he was a defeated monarch, forced to pay tribute and watch as Rome redrew the map of Asia. His prestige among his subjects declined, and rebellions simmered in regions where loyalty had always been fragile. Desperate for revenue, Antiochus turned to less conventional means. In 187 BC, he attempted to plunder the temple of Bel in Elymais, hoping to seize its treasures for his strained treasury. The attempt ended in disaster. Local resistance rose, and Antiochus was killed in the raid. The manner of his death shocked contemporaries. A king once celebrated as Alexander's heir perished not on the battlefield, but as a looter, undone by the empire's financial desperation. The reign of Antiochus III had spanned more than 3 decades. It was a story of highs and lows, the humiliation at Raphia, the triumph of the Anabasis, the decisive victory at Panion, and finally the ruin at Magnesia. His legacy was mixed. He had restored the empire after its fragmentation, but he had also overextended, drawing Rome into the eastern Mediterranean and exposing the Seleucids to a new and relentless rival. What Seleucus IV inherited was still an immense empire, though weakened and weighed down by heavy debts. The eastern satrapies remained loosely attached, Asia Minor was lost, and Egypt remained hostile. The dynasty survived, but its ambitions had been curbed. No longer could a Seleucid king dream of restoring Alexander's dominion. The reality of Roman power had ended such visions. More than an agreement, the Treaty of Apamea announced a turning point. Power in the Mediterranean had shifted, and Rome, once remote, had stepped in as the master of kingdoms. The Seleucids, though still rulers of a great empire, were reduced to clients of a new order. Antiochus's death sealed this transformation, closing the chapter of his grand ambitions with an ending steeped in irony and decline. Seleucus IV inherited his father's throne in 187 BC, but not the glory that had once defined Antiochus the Great. What remained was a kingdom heavily burdened by Rome's demands. The Treaty of Apamea required 15,000 talents of silver to be paid over 12 years. Annual installments drained the treasury and forced Seleucus into a reign defined less by ambition than by financial survival. To meet obligations, the king increased taxation and pressed governors to remit revenues with strict regularity. Such policies bred resentment among local elites, especially in the wealthiest provinces. Even temples, long protected by royal privilege, came under pressure. In Judea, for instance, rumors spread that Seleucid officials planned to seize sacred treasures to pay Rome. These fears damaged trust, even though Seleucus himself seems to have ruled with moderation compared to later kings. The strain reached a dramatic moment in 175 BC. Heliodorus, the king's chief minister, was dispatched to Jerusalem to inspect the temple treasury. Sources from the Jewish tradition portray the episode as an attempted confiscation of sacred funds, interrupted by miraculous intervention. What is certain is that the mission created anger and suspicion. Not long afterward, Heliodorus assassinated Seleucus, leaving the dynasty without its careful, cautious ruler. In the chaos that followed, the throne passed not to Seleucus's young son, but to his brother, Antiochus IV. This was possible only because Antiochus had recently returned from Rome, where he had lived for years as a hostage under the terms of Apamea. Exposure to Roman politics had shaped his sense of kingship. He had witnessed triumphal processions, senatorial debates, and the projection of Roman authority. These experiences left a mark. When he assumed the Seleucid throne, he carried both the humiliation of captivity and the determination to restore dignity to his dynasty. Antiochus IV styled himself Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. The title reflected both self-confidence and theatricality. Unlike his cautious brother, he cultivated a flamboyant public image. He staged processions in Antioch that rivaled anything seen in Alexandria, with elephants, golden chariots, and vast parades of soldiers. The grand display at Daphne in 166 BC involved more than 50,000 troops, an open attempt to show that the Seleucid monarchy still commanded power despite its restrictions. His reign quickly turned toward foreign adventure. The Sixth Syrian War against Egypt began in 170 BC, when Antiochus invaded to assert dominance over the Ptolemaic kingdom. With Egypt weakened by internal strife, Antiochus scored swift victories. He captured Memphis, proclaimed himself protector of the young Ptolemy VI, and came close to uniting Egypt with the Seleucid realm. The success alarmed Rome. In 168 BC, as Antiochus prepared to besiege Alexandria, a Roman envoy named Popilius Lanus confronted him near the city. According to tradition, Popilius drew a circle around the king in the sand and demanded that he decide, before stepping out, whether he would withdraw or face Rome's wrath. Antiochus hesitated, but ultimately yielded. The moment, remembered as the Day of Eleusis, symbolized the limits imposed by Roman power. The Seleucid Empire might still fight Egypt, but it could not defy Rome. Frustrated abroad, Antiochus turned inward. Judea, lying on the road between Syria and Egypt, became the stage for conflict. Earlier, Antiochus III had granted the Jews significant privileges, including tax exemptions for the temple. Under Antiochus IV, finances grew desperate. The temple's wealth was an irresistible target. Struggles among Jewish factions for the high priesthood further entangled the king, as rival claimants bribed the court for recognition. Tensions boiled over in 167 BC. Antiochus imposed decrees that banned traditional Jewish practices, circumcision, Sabbath observance, and sacrifices according to the law. An altar to Zeus was erected in the Jerusalem temple, a desecration that outraged the population. These measures sparked the Maccabean revolt, led first by Mattathias and then by his son Judah. Small bands of guerrillas inflicted defeats on Seleucid detachments, gaining momentum with each victory. The conflict revealed how fragile royal authority had become when religious legitimacy was lost. While Judea burned, Antiochus embarked on another eastern expedition. He marched into Persia to collect revenues and assert control over provinces that often acted independently. In 164 BC, during this campaign, he fell ill and died, leaving the throne to his young son, Antiochus V. The sudden end of his reign removed the only figure strong enough to balance external threats and internal rebellion. The legacy of Antiochus IV was deeply controversial. To some, especially Greek observers, he was a brilliant, energetic king who briefly restored Seleucid prestige. His campaigns in Egypt demonstrated daring, and his processions in Antioch created an aura of magnificence. To others, particularly in Judea, he became a villain remembered for persecution and sacrilege. Later generations would call him Epimanes, the madman, a play on his chosen title of Epiphanes. His reign illustrated both the possibilities and the dangers of flamboyant kingship. The Seleucid Empire could still project power, but every success was checked by Rome or undermined by domestic unrest. Victories in Egypt ended not with triumph, but with humiliation at Roman hands. Attempts to extract wealth from temples created revolts instead of revenue. In death, Antiochus left an empire no stronger than he had found it, but far more unstable. The contrast between Seleucus IV and Antiochus IV is striking. The elder brother governed with caution, prioritizing the slow work of meeting obligations to Rome. His assassination removed a steady, if uninspiring, ruler. The younger brother pursued glory, parades, and expansion, but his boldness brought the empire into direct collision with forces it could not overcome. Together, their reigns reveal the dilemma of the Seleucid kings. Restrained caution could not restore the empire's greatness, while reckless ambition risked accelerating its collapse. By 164 BC, the Seleucid state faced challenges on every front. Rome had declared its authority in the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, though weakened, remained a constant rival. Judea was in open revolt. The east provided revenue, but demanded costly expeditions to enforce loyalty. Into this precarious situation stepped regents and generals, left to govern for a child king whose throne rested on the edge of disintegration. The story of the Seleucid Empire after Antiochus IV was no longer about expansion or restoration. It was about survival against rising enemies and internal fragmentation. The glory of Antiochus III had been undone, and the title of Epiphanes proved as ironic as it was ambitious. The death of Antiochus IV in 164 BC left the Seleucid throne in the hands of a child. Antiochus V Eupator, barely 9 years old, became king under the regency of his minister Lysias. A kingdom already under strain now faced the hazards of minority rule, where generals and courtiers wielded power behind the facade of royal authority. Rivalries soon emerged. Philip, another officer, claimed authority in the young king's name and challenged Lysias. Civil conflict broke out, weakening central control just when the empire could least afford division. The Roman Senate, which had watched Antiochus IV with suspicion, welcomed the chaos, knowing that a fractured Seleucid monarchy could no longer threaten Mediterranean stability. In 162 BC, a figure with stronger claims appeared. Demetrius, son of Seleucus IV, had spent years in Rome as a hostage. He escaped, returned to Syria, and quickly gained support as the rightful heir. Antiochus V and Lysias were executed, and Demetrius I took the throne. His reign began with decisive action, but the challenges he faced were immense. Demetrius I confronted both external enemies and internal unrest. The Jews, emboldened by the Maccabean revolt, continued to resist Seleucid authority. Jonathan, brother of Judah Maccabee, maneuvered skillfully, winning recognition from both Seleucid and foreign rulers. At the same time, rivals backed by Egypt and other powers promoted pretenders to the throne. Alexander Ballas, claiming to be a son of Antiochus IV, emerged as a challenger. With Egyptian support, he defeated and killed Demetrius I in 150 BC, seizing Antioch for himself. Ballas's rule, however, was weak. His marriage to Cleopatra Thea, daughter of Ptolemy VI, tied him to Egypt, but his reliance on foreign allies alienated many within Syria. In 145 BC, Demetrius II, son of Demetrius I, returned to claim the throne. He defeated Ballas and established his own rule, marrying Cleopatra Thea after the death of her first husband. Even at the center of power, alliances shifted constantly, with royal marriages serving as tools of survival. While the royal house fought its internal battles, the East slipped away. Parthia, under Mithridates I, expanded aggressively. Around 148 BC, the Parthians captured Media, and by 141 BC, they seized Babylonia, including Seleucia on the Tigris. This was not a temporary revolt, but the permanent loss of the empire's economic heart. With Babylonia gone, Seleucid revenues collapsed, and the dynasty never recovered full control of its eastern core. Demetrius II attempted to respond with an eastern campaign. In 138 BC, he marched against Parthia, but his forces were defeated. Captured by Mithridates, he spent 10 years as an honored prisoner. During his captivity, he married a Parthian princess, a union designed to keep him bound to Parthian interests. His absence plunged Syria into further turmoil, leaving the throne vulnerable to usurpers. In his place, a general named Diodotus Tryphon rose to power. Using a child claimant, Antiochus VI, as a figurehead, Tryphon seized Antioch and ruled in his own right after murdering the boy. His usurpation revealed how fragile the monarchy had become. Provincial strongmen, backed by mercenary forces, could now outmatch kings. The once grand Seleucid court had become one faction among many competing for Syria's cities and resources. Amid this chaos emerged Antiochus VII, known as Sidetes. Brother of Demetrius II, he claimed the throne in 138 BC, marrying Cleopatra Thea to legitimize his rule. Unlike many of his immediate predecessors, Sidetes showed vigor and competence. He restored order in Antioch, reorganized finances, and rebuilt the army. His campaigns soon turned against Judea, where Simon Maccabeus had secured autonomy. Sidetes besieged Jerusalem in 134 BC, forcing submission from John Hyrcanus, Simon's successor. Judea agreed to pay tribute and supply troops, a temporary restoration of Seleucid authority. With the West pacified, Sidetes launched the most ambitious counteroffensive of the late Seleucid era. In 130 BC, he marched east with a vast army, determined to reclaim lands lost to Parthia. At first, success came swiftly. He retook Mesopotamian cities, restored Seleucid garrisons, and advanced into Media. For a moment, it seemed the empire might rise again. Still, the campaign exposed the same weaknesses that had haunted the dynasty for generations. The Seleucid army was large, but dependent on local support. During the winter of 129 BC, Sidetes dispersed his forces into separate quarters across Media. Parthian king Phraates II exploited this error, coordinating attacks on the isolated detachments. The Seleucid columns were destroyed in detail, and Sidetes himself fell in battle. Ancient accounts suggest he may have taken his own life, rather than be captured. Such defeat ended the last serious attempt to restore Seleucid power in the east. Parthia retained Babylonia permanently, reducing the Seleucid Empire to Syria and fragments of Asia Minor. Sidetes' death was honored even by his enemies. His body was returned with respect, but the dynasty he fought to save entered irreversible decline. The years that followed revealed how far the Seleucid realm had fallen. With Demetrius II released from Parthian captivity, he returned to rule, but his authority was hollow. Cleopatra Thea, his queen, became the true power in Antioch, maneuvering between her husbands and sons to preserve influence. Civil wars, assassinations, and rival claimants defined the period. Antiochus VII Sidetes stands out as the last Seleucid ruler to display genuine energy and ambition. His campaigns briefly restored hope that Alexander's legacy might endure in the east, but his defeat confirmed the empire's limits. After 129 BC, the Seleucid kingdom was no longer a great power, but a fractured state surviving on the margins of stronger neighbors. The death of Antiochus VII Sidetes in 129 BC ended the last serious attempt to revive Seleucid power in the east. His army had been destroyed in Media, and Babylonia remained firmly under Parthian control. From that point onward, the Seleucid kingdom ceased to be a great empire and became instead a fragile state centered on Syria. The core lands around Antioch and a scattering of cities in Asia Minor remained, but the transcontinental dominion of Seleucus I was gone. Into this diminished realm returned Demetrius II, released from Parthian captivity after a decade. The Parthians calculated that sending him back would destabilize Syria more effectively than holding him. Their judgment proved accurate. Demetrius II's second reign was marked by incompetence, cruelty, and popular discontent. He alienated the army, offended city elites, and quickly became a liability. In 125 BC, Cleopatra Thea, his formidable queen, arranged his assassination. For years she maneuvered between her sons and rivals, emerging as one of the most powerful women in Seleucid history. Her rule through her sons introduced an era of endless civil war. Antiochus VIII, known as Grypus, and his half-brother Antiochus IX, called Caesar, fought each other for control of Syria. Their rivalry split the kingdom into competing courts, with Antioch and Damascus exchanging hands repeatedly. At times, as many as 5 different claimants styled themselves king, each controlling fragments of territory with the backing of mercenaries or foreign allies. The pattern of rule became one of constant instability. Instead of centralized authority, cities relied on their own militias, mercenary captains, or strong local leaders. Coinage from the period illustrates the chaos. Rival kings issued competing currencies, each with his own portrait and royal titles, circulating simultaneously within the same regions. For merchants and subjects alike, the Seleucid crown no longer represented unity but confusion. Meanwhile, external pressures mounted. Armenia, once a tributary, rose under Tigranes II. By 83 BC, he invaded Syria, annexed Antioch, and proclaimed himself King of Kings. The Seleucid monarchs were reduced to figureheads under Armenian authority. Though Roman generals would later defeat Tigranes and restore a semblance of Seleucid rule, the restoration was hollow. The dynasty existed only at Rome's discretion. Rome's involvement deepened with each decade. The Republic had already declared its role as arbiter of Eastern politics after defeating Antiochus III. Now it acted openly in Syrian affairs, backing or deposing Seleucid claimants according to convenience. In 69 BC, Lucullus defeated Tigranes and briefly restored Antiochus XIII to the throne. Yet the king ruled not as an independent monarch, but as a client of Rome, dependent on their favor for legitimacy. Civil conflict continued even under Roman shadow. Rival branches of the dynasty, supported by local factions or foreign powers, refused to yield. Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra VII of Egypt and widow of several Seleucid kings, claimed authority for her sons. Arab tribes in the region exploited the instability, carving out influence in the Syrian desert. Each year seemed to produce a new claimant, a new rebellion, or a new intervention. The end came with scarcely a fight. In 64 BC, Pompey the Great entered Syria during his eastern campaigns. He found the kingdom torn by civil war, its rulers unable to maintain order. Antiochus XIII, the last significant claimant, was deposed and pensioned off. Another pretender, Philip II, lingered briefly before being killed by an Arab chieftain. With no stable authority left, Pompey declared Syria a Roman province. The Seleucid Empire, once stretching from the Aegean to India, ended not with a climactic battle, but with administrative absorption. The legacy of the Seleucid dynasty was complex. At its height under Seleucus I and Antiochus III, it had been one of the largest and most culturally diverse kingdoms of the Hellenistic age. Its rulers founded cities that blended Greek and local traditions. From Antioch on the Orontes to Seleucia on the Tigris, they sponsored temples in Babylon, minted coins with imagery drawn from multiple cultures, and presided over courts where Greek philosophers debated alongside Persian nobles. Yet the very size of the empire made it fragile. Maintaining authority across thousands of miles required constant military presence and endless negotiation with local elites. Whenever the dynasty showed weakness, satrapies slipped away. Parthia and Bactria emerged from these cracks, while Judea won independence during the Maccabean revolt. Internal rivalries only worsened the problem. Brothers turned against brothers. Queens maneuvered against husbands, and generals seized power whenever opportunity arose. By the 1st century BC, the Seleucid kings ruled little more than Syria itself, and even there they depended on Roman arbitration. The dynasty that had once dreamed of reviving Alexander's empire was reduced to quarreling claimants whose coins circulated briefly before being melted down by the next rival. Still, the Seleucid achievement should not be measured only in decline. For nearly 2 centuries, they preserved the fusion of East and West initiated by Alexander. Their cities became centers of commerce, learning, and culture. Antioch flourished as one of the great metropolises of the Mediterranean, later to play a central role in Roman and Christian history. Seleucid experiments in integrating Greek and local traditions left lasting marks on administration, urban planning, and religion. The fall of the Seleucid Empire closed a chapter in the story of Alexander's successors. Ptolemaic Egypt survived slightly longer, falling to Rome in 30 BC, while the Antigonid line in Macedon had already been extinguished. Of all the dynasties born from Alexander's conquests, none matched the Seleucids in geographic breadth or in the difficulty of holding such a realm together. Their failure reflected the limits of monarchy stretched across diverse peoples and vast distances, where loyalty depended as much on local identities as on royal decrees. When Pompey annexed Syria, no armies rose to defend the Seleucid crown. The people of the cities had grown weary of endless civil wars, and Roman order promised stability. In that sense, the Seleucid Empire did not fall in defeat, but in exhaustion. What began with Alexander's dream of world conquest ended with bureaucratic efficiency from Rome. The memory of the Seleucid kings faded, their coins buried, their cities absorbed into new empires. Yet their story remains essential for understanding the centuries between Alexander and Rome. It was a story of ambition, resilience, cultural fusion, and ultimate fragility. From the triumph of Ipsus to the humiliation at Apamea, from the eastern campaigns of Antiochus III to the desperate gamble of Sidetes, the Seleucid dynasty embodied both the heights and the limits of Hellenistic monarchy.